It all began on the steppe. On the backs of the first domesticated horses, a wild and warlike people rode across the sweeping plains of the Russian steppe. They rode into the heart of Europe, decimating the local populations and bringing with them death and plague. Behind them, on wagons whose wheels were painted with the sign of the sun, followed their women and children in great caravans. At the same time, these nomadic steppe peoples thundered on their horses, chariots, and wagons down into the Middle East as far as Mesopotamia, across Asia and Russia, even penetrating into China, all the way to India, where they established Vedic culture and the rigid Hindu caste systems. We call these steppe peoples the Indo-Europeans. Everywhere they went, they conquered, installed themselves as ruling castes, intermarried, and integrated with the local populations, leaving behind their language, religion, and genetics. It is from the synthesis of the Indo-Europeans with the farming populations of Europe that the genetic and cultural foundations of Europe were laid. It is to the Indo-Europeans that we can trace the many sister languages and cultures of Europe. And it is with these strange, savage, yet somehow familiar horse lords that we can find the origin of the most important story, not only in the history of Europe, but I believe in the history of the world, the story of the heroic ideal. In approximately 8000 BC, farmer populations from Anatolia began to migrate into Europe, mixing with and replacing the Western hunter-gatherer populations. Together, they formed the population called the early European farmers, with a greater percentage of Western hunter-gatherer DNA in the north and a greater percentage of Anatolian DNA in the south. To the east, the pastoralist peoples of the Russian steppe had risen from a combination of Eastern hunter-gatherers and Caucasus hunter-gatherers. The first wave of Indo-Europeans came into Europe around 3000 BC and consisted of the Yamnaya, named after the grave mounds which they left behind. We use the term Indo-Europeans to refer to the Yamnaya and their various offshoots, branches, and related cultures, similarly to how we use the term Germanic peoples, or the ancient Greeks. The corded ware, bell-beaker, Sintashta, and Andronovo cultures all derived a large portion of their ancestry from the Yamnaya, and can all be considered Indo-European peoples. The same goes for the peoples who moved east. While agriculture had allowed the Anatolian farmer populations to move into and dominate Europe, the domesticated horse and the technology of the wheel, the wagon, and later the chariot is what allowed the Indo-Europeans to expand so rapidly. But what drove their expansion? You awake to screaming in the night. You leap from your bed and take up your bow and arrow. You motion for your wife and children to stay inside, and step out of your hut into the light of the full moon. At once, a massive figure catches your eye. It is advancing towards you between the straw huts. Its gait is like that of a man, but it stands twice as tall, and its fur gleams silver in the moonlight. Dread and terror grip you. You raise your bow to shoot, but your hands are trembling. You have heard the rumors. Wolfmen roaming the countryside. In the dead of night, they appear with no warning, riding the backs of horses. They burn and pillage, plunder women and food, and then they are gone as quickly as they appeared, like demons vanished into the night. You loose your arrow, but it is too late. The last thing you see before the axe splits open your chest is a savage face with teeth bared in a snarl, not the face of a wolf, but a man. All across Europe, we receive the myth of the werewolf, meaning man-wolf in Old English. In Norse and Germanic culture, we have the infamous berserker warriors, who would enter into a rage-driven battle frenzy. They were referred to as wolf-skinned or wolf-coat. Similarly, the name Odin may have originally meant something like frenzy, rage, or madness, and Odin is closely associated with wolves. In ancient Greece, Lysa, derived from Lykos, meaning wolf, was the spirit of fury, madness, and rabid animals. The same is true in the Latin tradition, and Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome themselves, were raised in the wilderness by a she-wolf. In Book 10 of the Iliad, by far the strangest and most out-of-place chapter, Diomedes and Odysseus don animal skins and raid the Trojan camp by night. This episode is so strange because the Iliad places emphasis on kleos, glory gained in battle, which can only be achieved if people see your heroic deeds, hence the gleaming polished armor and horsehair plumes. In the night, shrouded in animal skins and darkness, there is no glory. But in the broader traditions of Europe, it does not seem out of place. As part of Spartan training, the youths would be sent out in the night to prowl the countryside and slit the throats of any helots they could find. When all of these associated traditions, linguistic constructions, and symbolic associations are compared, we can begin to wonder whether they have a common origin. Scholars have posited a speculative reconstruction of an ancient Indo-European initiation ritual, in which young warriors would have taken on a ritual identification with wolves, perhaps shedding their human identity to descend into the madness of divine rage and bloodlust. They may have fought naked except for animal skins, as was custom in the Germanic and Celtic tribes, and as was the standard for depictions of Greek and Roman heroes. They may have been expelled from their tribe to wander the woods in packs, raiding and plundering by night. Scholars have called this speculative reconstruction the Koryos. With a surplus of population on the steppe, bands of young wolf warriors, either voluntarily or by ritual expulsion, would set out in search of new lands to settle and new peoples to plunder. Such a tradition would match the archaeological record. The Indo-Europeans expanded in waves, leaving behind graves with mostly young males. They left behind a trail of destruction, yet they also took farmer women as their wives, or at least as their mates. The reconstruction of the Koryos shows us the method for all Indo-European studies. The Indo-Europeans were first discovered through the echoes of their language. As early as the 1500s, an English scholar and missionary to India noted the similarities between the Indian languages Greek and Latin. In 1786, Sir William Jones, a scholar of linguistics, said the following during one of his lectures, quote, "The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a strong affinity, both in the roots of verbs and the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer could examine all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which, perhaps, no longer exists." End quote. By the 1800s, Franz Bopp had written the first comparative grammar of Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, and the study of the Indo-European languages and their origin had become an official discipline. We can tell much from the words which we have received from the Indo-Europeans. Since we have a similar word for wheel in all Indo-European derived languages, we can be certain that they had the wheel before their expansion, when their language was relatively homogeneous. If, however, all of the words for grain in Indo-European derived languages are different, and I'm making this example up, it means that these words were borrowed from other languages, and that the Indo-Europeans did not have lots of agricultural vocabulary before their expansion. Using Indo-European derived languages and mythologies, we can reconstruct what the Indo-Europeans may have believed, and linguists can even use the rules of language transformation to posit what their words may have sounded like. For example, the Latin Jupiter, the Greek Zeus Pater, and the Hindu Deus Piter, and even the Norse Tyr are almost certainly all derived from an original Skyfather deity, whose name may have been something like Deus Peter. And all of these gods' association with the sky, thunder, lightning, hammers, battling serpents, and riding chariots gives us a good idea of how this original deity may have been represented. From the Russian steppe, he thundered north on his chariot, becoming Thor, and at the same time he thundered east, becoming Indra. Helios rides his chariot through the sky, while Poseidon rides his chariot through the sea. Elements of this original Skyfather deity appear in the mythologies of every region which the Indo-Europeans conquered. One of the most important symbols which we receive from the Indo-Europeans is the sun wheel, which represents both the sun and the wheel. One might speculate about the invention of wheels. Did the steppe peoples first construct sun-like discs as religious symbols and then come to see their practical use? Or was the symbolism of the sun only later imposed on the wheel once it became the facilitator of their lifestyle? Since the Indo-Europeans were a pastoralist people, cattle is also very important in their derivative mythologies, and the trope of stealing cattle often appears. Cows are sacred in Hinduism, bulls were a prime sacrifice in ancient Greek and Roman traditions. In the Odyssey, Odysseus's men steal the cattle of the chariot-riding sun god Helios. Hercules' 10th labor is to travel to the ends of the earth and steal the cattle of the monster Geryon. And the Norse creation myth begins with a cosmic cow. Europe may even derive its name from a metaphor for cows. In the myth of Europa, Zeus turns into a bull to ravage the princess Europa. Europa means wide face, which is thought to have been an Indo-European phrase denoting the earth, but it is my belief that it may have also doubled as a metaphor for the cow with its wide face. This would make sense, since what gave the Indo-Europeans sustenance was not the grain of the earth, but the milk and meat of cattle. The Scythians, as recorded by Herodotus, may give us the best recorded example of what the ancient Indo-Europeans may have been like. The Scythians were a nomadic people from the Pontic-Caspian steppe who were employed as royal bodyguards across Europe and the Near East. Herodotus recounts that they were nearly undefeated in battle, since using their horses, they could attack and flee as they pleased. Concerning the Scythians, Herodotus writes, quote, "They have no precise limit of age laid down for their life, but when a man becomes very old, his nearest of kin come together and slaughter him solemnly, and his cattle also with him, and then after that they boil the flesh and banquet upon it. This is considered by them the happiest lot, but him who has ended his life by disease they do not eat, but cover him up in the earth, counting it a misfortune that he did not attain to being slaughtered. They sow no crops, but live on cattle and on fish, which they get in abundance from the river Araxes. Moreover, they are drinkers of milk. Of gods they reverence the sun alone, and to him they sacrifice horses. And the rule of the sacrifice is this: to the swiftest of the gods they sacrifice the swiftest of all mortal things." End quote. The tale of the slaughter of kinsmen and cattle may be distorted, but it echoes the sentiments found in all Indo-European warrior cultures. Better to die young in battle than of old age or disease. Additionally, the sacrifice of horses is attested in the Avestan, as well as in Roman and Celtic sources. It is also interesting that Herodotus writes that when the Scythians would take their intoxicating hemp baths, they would, quote, "howl like wolves." Concerning another of the Scythian tribes, Herodotus writes, quote, "These men, it would seem, are wizards, for it is said of them by the Scythians, and by the Hellenes who are settled in the Scythian land, that once in every year each of the Neuroi become a wolf for a few days, and then returns again to his original form. For my part, I do not believe them when they say this, but they say it nevertheless, and swear it, moreover." End quote. And concerning yet another Scythian tribe, he writes, The Androphagoi have the most savage manners of all human beings, and they neither acknowledge any rule of right nor observe any customary law. They are nomads and wear clothing like that of the Scythians, but have a language of their own, and alone of all these nations they are man-eaters." End quote. Could these tales echo the berserker wolf warriors who once roamed the steppe? And more importantly, could the ritual initiation of the Koryos, the nomadic lifestyle of the steppe peoples, their superior diets, their beliefs and ritual practices, be replicated in and adapted to the modern world? Could the great conquerors of the steppe, after all these years, return? The influence of the Indo-Europeans is baked into the very history, genetics, mythologies, and religions of Europe. All across Europe, from the east to the British Isles, we find the worship of the Sky Father, the Great Thunderer, as well as reverence for the sun and the use of sun discs, wheels, crosses, and other solar symbols. Even in Christianity, the worship of the sun, through the solar symbolism of the dying and rising Christ, was preserved. From the medieval knight and the equestrian practices of European aristocracies to the cowboys of the American frontier, we see the echoes of the horse warriors of the steppe. From the synthesis of the Indo-European steppe peoples and the European hunter-gatherer and farmer cultures blossomed the heroic cultures of the Greeks, the Romans, the Vikings, the Germanic and Celtic tribes, each unique traditions, unique branches, yet sharing one core, one trunk, one fundamental worldview, and sharing one aim, one aspiration, the heroic ideal. In every age, from its origin on the Russian steppe, through the Greeks and Vikings, Homer and the Havamal, to the knights of Arthurian romance and the heroes of great westerns, preserved in modernity by writers like Mishima and Nietzsche, the heroic ideal has been the fulcrum of Western identity and the aspiration of all heroic cultures. And now it is up to us to carry on that ideal, to enrich it, to embody it, to fulfill it. For I assure you, as long as we live and breathe, as long as we can remember and move forward, the sun has not yet set on the age of heroes. Is there anything more divine than the beautiful human body? And was it not the Hellenes who first discovered it? That was the secret truth which the whole of their ecstatic religion revealed to them. Divinity is in the flesh. We often speak of the philosophy and statecraft which we inherited from the Greeks, but this is all abstract. The things which we inherited from the Greeks that we can still see and touch are their statues, depicting beautiful, powerful, athletic bodies. And implicit in these statues, concealed within their immortalized flesh, are the two greatest things which we have received from the Greeks: the idea of heroism and the idea of nature. The writings of Homer and Pindar show us how, for the Greeks, the beautiful body contained within it both the essence of heroism and of nature. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche wrote, quote, "In Athens, Cicero expresses his surprise that the men and youths were by far superior to the women in beauty. But what work and effort the male sex had demanded of itself for centuries, there in the service of beauty. For one must not be mistaken about the method here. Merely training one's feelings and thoughts is worth practically nil. First, one must convince the body. It is decisive for the lot of a people and of humanity that one begin culture at the right place, not in the soul, as was the fatal superstition of the priests and semi-priests. The right place is the body, demeanor, diet, physiology, and the rest is a consequence. For this reason, the Greeks are still the first cultural event of history. They knew, they did what was needed." End quote. The secret teaching of the Hellenes was opposite to the secret teaching of Christianity and its predecessors. For Homer's Greeks, the soul was something fleeting, and it was in the body or in its legacy that immortality could be found. In the Iliad, when the hero's body is torn apart by bronze and the earth drinks his lifeblood, all that is left is a shade which scuttles off to the underworld to wander, pale and listless, through the fields of Hades. Even Achilles' shade, as we discover in the Odyssey, sits in sorrow in the dark, bewailing his fate. When the lifeless corpse of a hero is consumed by birds or the flame of the funeral pyre, swallowed by the earth or the sea, all that is left is a pale whisper of what one once was, forever lost in a faraway land. But in that moment just before death, when one's body shines with divine splendor, when it exudes beauty and power, then the gods themselves are present in the flesh. Then one is Dios, shining, godlike. In the Iliad, Achilles is most divine in the height of his superhuman rage on the battlefield. He is described as godlike, Dios, literally meaning shining. He is compared with the forces of nature to a blazing fire. His divine heritage is repeatedly evoked, and he is even described as equal to a god. In his berserker rage, Achilles slaughters every Trojan who comes before his blade, and even contends with the river god Scamander. Quote, "Just as fierce fire rages through a dry mountainside, and the forest is consumed as the wind drives the flames and whirls them every which way, so raged godlike Achilles with his spear, pressing down upon the men he slew, and the earth ran black with blood. Just as white barley is tread beneath the feet of bellowing bulls, Achilles' horses trampled corpses and shields together, and the wheels of his chariot were splashed with blood. But Peleus' son pressed on to win himself glory, as his irresistible hands were splattered with gore." End quote. It is in the height of his glory, his splendor, his inhuman power, when he shines like a god and is as unstoppable as a force of nature, that Achilles achieves immortal glory through the superhuman power of his semi-divine body. In his moment of glory, Achilles shines so brightly that the light of his deeds and his name shine through the ages, even reaching us thousands of years later. This heroic ethos, expressed in early Greek works like those of Homer and Pindar, is completely opposite Christian doctrine and much of late Greek philosophy, which posits the body as profane and the soul as divine. In the Bible, the soul, not the body, is the image of God and the source of immortality. As the Apostle Paul argues in 1 Corinthians, resurrection is not for the, quote, natural body, but for the, quote, spiritual body, and, quote, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, end quote. When speaking of what happens to the body after resurrection, Paul writes, quote, "It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body," end quote. Paul elaborates that the body dies like a seed, but something new is born from it, the spiritual body, which is the metaphorical wheat. But for Homer's Greeks, that which blossomed from the dying body was immortal glory and everlasting fame. That was the only hope of immortality for the Greek hero. The feats of the body in pursuit of arete, distinction, and excellence was for the Greeks the highest virtue, and the everlasting glory the undying name thereby acquired was their immortality. This philosophy is contained within the poems of Pindar, a Theban lyric poet who wrote poems celebrating great athletes. In Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, Costin Alamariu writes about Pindar's use of the idea of nature. Quote, "Pindar's own explicit use of the word nature, physis, and associated forms of the verb from which physis itself is derived, seem at first sight to have multiple meanings, not directly related. The verb is usually translated in English as to grow, while the noun fue is translated as growth and also as stature. These translations, however, are limited and somewhat misleading. Nature, physis, fue, refers first of all and always and above all to a concrete material reality, to a biological reality that means very plainly the body. End quote. Through etymological reconstruction, we can tell that the Proto-Indo-European verb for to be also meant to grow, and that this may have been its original and primary meaning. To be is to grow, and thus the idea of being itself has a botanical meaning. Alamariu continues, quote, "Now, first of all, Greek does have another word for body, with which the reader may be better acquainted, namely soma, and Pindar does use the word soma 5 times by my count. In all but one case, the reference is exclusively to the dead body, to corpses. This is in keeping with the Homeric use of soma. When Pindar speaks of a body that is alive, he uses the word fue. Thus, already, in this distinction there is an important clue as to the full meaning of physis. In truth, this hint was already dormant in Homer's limited use. There is a botanical association in both Homeric usages of nature. The branch on which Achilles lays his great oath is said to be sprouting, and is contrasted to the dead wooden scepter in Agamemnon's hands, which stands for the authority granted from mere convention. In Pindar as well we see this same bare or old meaning of physis in 2 of the 17 examples. In one case, where there is a reference to a statue, quote, carved from a single piece of wood, end quote. The unusual choice of word here may be inspired by the fact that the object in question is a religious idol, consecrated to a god housed in a rustic altar, and therefore vibrant with demonic energy. The other example where nature has an explicitly botanical meaning is introduced in a prophecy that the centaur Chiron gives to Apollo, wherein a queen and future bride of Apollo is said to be given the land of Libya, quote, not unblessed by trees bearing all kinds of fruit, end quote. From Alamariu's analysis, we can see that fue is also associated with botanical life, fertility and reproduction, with becoming, growth, birth, and being. It thus strikes at the heart of the Greek mystery rites, which celebrated the miraculous rebirth of life out of death, which takes place in the plant world and is mirrored in the generational reproduction of men. The Homeric hymn to Demeter outlines, though not explicitly, the meaning of the Greek mystery rites, in particular the Eleusinian mysteries. The hymn to Demeter is a story about death, symbolized by Persephone being kidnapped by Hades and the resultant death of all plants on Earth. It is a story about reproduction, symbolized by Persephone's metaphorical loss of virginity when she eats of Hades' pomegranate seeds, and is therefore permanently wed to him. And it is a story of rebirth, when Persephone at last emerges from the underworld, bringing a rebirth of plant life on Earth, and therefore a salvation of man, who depends on the nourishment gained from plants to live. In Eleusis, archetypal image of mother and daughter, Carl Karenyi discusses the Homeric hymn to Demeter. He writes, quote, "The myth is related to the nourishment men derive from plants. The context can be characterized most suggestively with the help of Greek words. Zoe means not only the life of men and of all living creatures, but also what is eaten. In the Odyssey, the suitors wish to eat up the Zoe of Odysseus. The same meaning attaches to bios, the characteristic life of men, where men draw their nourishment chiefly from plants, the nutritive plants, not only grain, but the tuberous and fruit-bearing plants as well, are individually perishable, destructible, edible, but taken together they are the eternal guarantee of human life." End quote. The English word essence, from the Latin esse, to be, is etymologically connected with the German essen, to eat, and all of these words can be traced back to some original Proto-Indo-European notion related to being, growth, biology, nourishment, the body, and reproduction, something which we have received through the Greeks as the idea of nature. Alamariu goes on to lay out how, in Pindar, Fue is connected with arete, excellence and virtue. The man of Fue must obey his inner nature, his essence, which drives him towards deeds of glory. Alamariu writes, quote, "This obedience is expressed as their being ever ready to abandon safety and mere life for the danger of death and the winning of a great renown. But the point would seem to be that Fua literally carries some compulsory or irresistible power that orients and repels them towards deeds of areta." End quote. He continues, quote, "Real men, Andres, have being, or have more being. They have reverence for their being, or body, and listen to its vehement calling. They can't help but listen, or obey, in this case. These men are apparent and manifest in their great deeds. The watchful eye of the seer, the poet, picks these out and preserves the deeds in words to make them apparent, visible, through time, to make their fame or being endure." End quote. Those who are descended from the gods, and therefore share in their essence, demigod heroes like Hercules and Achilles, have more being, more reality than normal mortals. They are more real and more true because their essence, their will, their life force, their fue, is stronger. And this fue, this divine inner essence, is contained within their body and blood, and expressed through the ferocity and strength of their inner nature. Finally, we come to the complete picture. One's nature, one's biological being and essence, is found in the body, and in a certain sense is synonymous with the body. Thus, Fue, this intensified nature found in heroes, comes from kinship with the gods. It shines forth from the hero's body and drives them towards deeds of arete, excellence, which gain them immortal fame and even deification. The inner nature which drives all of life expresses itself in its highest, most pure form, in the beautiful, youthful body, filled with power and dynamic being. The beautiful, powerful body is the most pure form of being, of life. It is the most true and real thing. The awe at this pure being, found in the poems of Pindar, can also be found in the final lines of the Homeric hymn to Demeter, where Demeter says to her daughter, Persephone, quote, "When the earth sprouts with every kind of fragrant flower in the spring, out of the misty darkness you will rise again, a great marvel for gods and mortal folks." End quote. Demeter is foretelling the seasonal rebirth of youthful and vibrant life out of death, which was the miracle at the center of the Eleusinian mysteries. This worship of the essence at the heart of life and the desire to intensify this essence was the centerpiece of the Hellenic worldview, and more generally the Indo-European worldview. It is found in the European Christ, who is a Dionysian and Eleusinian deity, and represents the rebirth of youth, of life out of death, just as Persephone did. And it is found in Nietzsche's idea of the will to power, which might be equated with the Greek Fue, and the creation of the Übermensch, who, like the Greek heroes, possesses an intensified will to power, an intensified essence and being. This heroic worldview was somewhat suppressed during the Middle Ages in Europe due to Christianity's mistrust of the body and bodily passions. But during the Renaissance, the appreciation of the beautiful human form, of the heroic body as the highest flower and fruit of life emerged again. The heroic worldview had endured under medieval Europe's anti-corporeal veneer. But during the Reformation and Enlightenment, interest in physical culture went into hiding again, only to re-emerge in the 1800s with a revived interest in the classics, nature, and biology, driven by writers like Winkelmann, Darwin, and Nietzsche. In the 1800s, bodybuilding emerged again for the first time since classical times. In Germany, folkish back-to-nature movements emerged, which idolized the naked human form and holistic health, and championed a return to nature and paganism. Though these movements began as something akin to pagan hippie movements, their aesthetics and language carried over into fascist Germany and Italy. And probably in part due to this, interest in physical culture again waned after World War II, but it was revived once again during the 60s and 70s with American bodybuilding, and has only grown since. Perhaps this ancient spirit, which has been struggling for centuries to re-emerge, is at last here to stay. Today, gyms are filled with young men, and though they may not know it, they are implicitly embracing the heroic worldview and striving to allow their nature to shine out through their bodies as the highest and most intense expression of the essence of life and life's striving against entropy and death. In a synthetic, industrial age such as ours, when nature is far removed from most humans' lives, their inner nature draws them towards the image of the beautiful and powerful body, which is the most visceral and vivid expression of the heroic ideal. In Sun and Steel, Japanese writer Yukio Mishima wrote about how the discipline of steel restored vitality to his body and soul. As a young man, Mishima was sickly, frail, and overly intellectual, but the discipline of bodybuilding restored life to his body and spirit. He writes, quote, "The groups of muscles that have become virtually unnecessary in modern life, though still a vital element of a man's body, are obviously pointless from a practical point of view, and bulging muscles are as unnecessary as a classical education is to the majority of practical men. Muscles have gradually become something akin to classical Greek. To revive the dead language, the discipline of the steel was required. To change the silence of death into the eloquence of life, the aid of steel was essential." End quote. For Mishima, the antidote to modernity was found in the classical spirit, and the spirit was best embodied through the art of bodybuilding. The discipline of Sun and Steel educated his body in the classical spirit. It restored to his body fue, and therefore cured his body of modernity. Nietzsche believed that the modern man would appear as a pale shade in comparison with the man of ancient Greece, but he held out hope that men could again reach such heights and even surpass them. If we are to embark on this endeavor, if we are to turn the silence of death into the eloquence of life, if we are to transform shades back into demigods, we must begin with the body. In recent years, Vikings have exploded in popularity. From TV shows and movies to the Viking aesthetic, Viking music, and the rapid growth of Norse paganism. Before our eyes, we are watching the Vikings turning into a cornerstone of Western culture, like the Greeks and Romans. The culture of the Vikings was remarkably similar to that of the ancient Greeks, who have, in almost every Western culture which followed them, served as a wellspring of culture and a cornerstone of identity. I believe these two cultures, one in the southern tip of Europe, the other in its northernmost reaches, stand out to us so strongly because they both contained, so distinctly and vividly, all of the elements which make up the essence of the European heroic tradition. Both the Greeks and the Vikings shared a typically Indo-European hospitality culture, in which guests were to be treated well, honesty and reciprocity was expected from strangers, and a man's word was to live and die by. Both cultures shared the love of war, of glory gained in battle, the love of adventure and exploration, glee in trickery, deceit and wit, and a deep concern with fame, honor, and reputation. The Havamal, or the Words of the High One, is an Old Norse text containing advice about proper conduct in life, composed during the Viking Age. In the Havamal, it is written, quote, "Cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself must also die, but fair fame never dies, for he who has won it. Cattle die, kinsmen die, we ourselves also die. But I know one thing that never dies, judgment on each of the dead." End quote. This could easily be a quote from the Iliad, and in fact, if I did not know where this quote was from, I might have even assumed that it was Homer. And here's another quote from the Havamal. "Taciturn and prudent, and daring in war should a king's children be. Joyous and liberal everyone should be until his hour of death. A cowardly man thinks he will live forever if warfare he avoids, but old age will give him no peace, though spears may spare him." End quote. Here, the Havamal seems as if it could be speaking across culture, geography, and time, directly to the dilemma of Achilles' fate in the Iliad. Achilles, if you return from Troy and avoid warfare, you will find no peace in your old age. Go die in battle, for only a man's reputation is immortal. Yet here we also see a key difference between Viking and Greek culture, or at least the literature which we have received from them. In the writings of the Greeks, we see an inner anguish and internal contradiction in the heroes, which is less present in the characters of the Norse sagas. Achilles, though he eventually chooses death and glory over a long life, is tormented by his fate. And while this tragic element is still present in the Viking sagas, we also see an almost simple, straightforward desire for honor and glory. Unlike Achilles, the Norseman who died in battle found peace in Valhalla, a peace which consisted of eternal combat alongside the gods. I believe that in Viking culture, even more than in Greek culture, we see the ideal of the heroic death. When the Norseman died on the battlefield, the beautiful Valkyries would come to take him to Valhalla. In Homer, the Keres Thanatoio, Kyries of death, appear on the battlefield. They are clear etymological and mythological equivalents to the Valkyries, but they have no positive connotation. One can make a comparison between the Greek Elysian fields, an afterlife paradise reserved for demigods and heroes, and Valhalla. Yet in the Greek tradition, the emphasis is on the dreary and dark afterworld and the tragic fate of the hero. In contrast, when reading the poetic Edda, you get a sense of a simplicity and practicality which distinguishes the Vikings from the Greeks, a sort of practical, matter-of-fact disregard for death. I think Robert Eggers captured this spirit beautifully in his movie The Northman. But this is not to say that the Vikings were simple in any derogatory sense. They, like the Greeks, delighted in trickery and cleverness. In Thrumskvida, a giant has stolen Thor's hammer and will only return it in exchange for the hand of Freya in marriage. Instead, the gods send Thor, dressed up as Freya, to trick the giant. Once Thor grasps Mjolnir, he casts off his disguise and kills the giant and his family. When reading this episode, I could not help but be reminded of Odysseus and the tricks which he played on Polyphemus. The Vikings, like the Greeks, were a great seafaring culture. In both cultures, we can see the Indo-European love of exploration, adventure, and expansion, whether by horse, chariot, or boat. Odysseus' unwilling adventures, whether entirely invented or based upon historical events, were equaled, if not surpassed, by the Vikings. The first European to set foot on the Americas, at least in recorded history, was not Christopher Columbus in 1492, but the Viking Leif Erikson, 500 years earlier, in just 1000 AD. In the Icelandic saga of Eric the Red, we hear the story of Leif's father, named the Red either because of his hair his temper, or perhaps both. Eric was born in Norway, but grew up in Iceland after his father was exiled from Norway for murder. And following in his father's footsteps, Eric would be exiled from Iceland for murder and sail west, where he would discover and settle Greenland. In the saga of the Greenlanders, we hear of Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, who was born in Iceland but grew up in Greenland after his father's expulsion. Leif would sail even further west than his father, making land on North America, which he would call Vinland. The sagas even describe Leif's encounters with Native Americans, which is truly mind-boggling to imagine. The discovery of Viking settlements in Newfoundland, Canada, confirmed the historical reality behind the events of these sagas, and these sagas themselves come to us from Iceland, which, perhaps counter to our assumptions about the Norse, had a rich literary culture. And I believe this is part of the reason for the recent explosion in the popularity of the Vikings. Unlike the Greeks and Romans, much of Norse culture is yet unexplored, or at least unexhausted. While Greek and Roman culture has been explored, celebrated, and elaborated upon for thousands of years, the culture of the Norse serves as fresh soil for new sprouts to grow upon. I also believe that interest in the Vikings has grown out of a broader interest in native European culture. As other peoples embrace their indigenous roots, Northern Europeans are eager to find their native culture, and this also drives the rapid growth of Norse paganism. Historically, Northern Europe was most resistant to Christianity, and even when they converted, it was often just paganism with a Christian veneer. And it seems to me, as Norse paganism returns with strength, that the North will be the first to abandon Christianity. I believe paganism will see increasing growth in Europe, especially with the pressures of Islam and mass migration. Europeans will be forced to find an exclusive cultural identity for themselves, beyond nation and geography, which Christianity does not offer. They will be forced to define their native culture and heritage, and to move away from universalist ideas, both politically in the form of liberalism and culturally in the form of Christianity. But I do not think that this means that Christianity will go extinct in Europe. My hope is that we will see a plurality of religions, which can serve as the soil for a new cultural renaissance, and can all be viewed as outgrowths of the European heroic tradition, like branches on a tree, or a river feeding different outlets. As the river moves through time, smaller rivers branch off, each representing different heroic cultures: the Greeks, the Romans, the Vikings, the various pagan traditions, the Renaissance, and medieval Christianity. And there needn't be a struggle for supremacy between these traditions. Each can exist as a branch on a tree, its roots stretching into the distant past, and its branches into the distant future, each branching culture representing a unique expression of the heroic ideal, and yet their essence, their sap, remaining the same. And on this great tree, the Norse were certainly one of the most magnificent branches. Is the West defined by Christian or pagan values? This is a debate which has been explicit in the intellectual tradition since Nietzsche, and implicit in the history of the West ever since the Christianization of Rome. Today, those on the side of pagan values argue that it is the Greeks, the inventors of heroism, who stand at the genesis of Western civilization. They argue that all of our values have pagan origins, that the West was born with the great feats of Hercules and Achilles, but Christians argue that it was during the Middle Ages that the first self-conscious, pan-European culture came about, under Christianity. And they have a point. Though a lot of classical culture and pagan heritage was lost or destroyed during the Dark Ages, they also produced a colorful, heroic culture, in many ways equal in its splendor to classical culture. When one thinks of the Western heroic tradition, does one not at once conjure the image of a knight astride a massive steed with polished armor gleaming in the sun? The culture of medieval European chivalry, as preserved for us in Arthurian literature, is as distinctly heroic and European as the culture of the Greeks and the Vikings, and I believe that the corpus of Arthurian literature is as much an essential part of the Western heroic canon as Homer and the Norse sagas. This is because the chivalric worldview of Arthurian literature is an extension of the same heroic worldview found in the writings of the Hellenes and the Norse. And the Christianity of these texts is, in a certain sense, a pagan Christianity. And here I use pagan in a general sense, to refer to the worldview and values which were native to Europe since antiquity and before, the heroic worldview. A worldview which in no way resembles the Abrahamic faiths of the East, or early Christian values and sentiments which were anti-Roman and anti-pagan. And I also use pagan here to invoke its original meaning, rustic, rural, natural, pertaining to the practices, gods, and beliefs of the European countryside. The Christianity of Arthurian literature is very much a religion of the land and forests of Europe, of nature, of spirits, apparitions, and mysteries in the Greek sense. Arthurian Christianity is an essentially mystical, pagan worldview, with the mystery of Christ and the Grail at its center. Its Christ is an Eleusinian Christ, who evokes Dionysus, Persephone, and Odin, a god of nature, of miracles, of blood, wine, and the mystery of the immortality of vegetative life achieved through reproduction. The Arthurian Christ is a god of chivalry, a king of heroes, and himself a hero who, like Persephone, Hercules, and many other pagan heroes, made the descent into the underworld and rose again triumphant. The canon of Arthurian literature, which is part of the literary category referred to as the Matter of Britain, is extremely extensive. From these texts we get the tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, King Arthur and his court at Camelot, Merlin and Morgan Le Fay, Percival and the quest for the Grail, Gawain and the Green Knight. But to understand these tales we must understand the historical setting. Somewhere around 600 BC, the Celts began to migrate into the British Isles, influencing them culturally, genetically, and linguistically. In 43 AD, the Romans began their conquest of Britain and settled most of England, then inhabited by the Britons. The Romans established a colony called Britannia, but they were unable to take what is now Scotland, Ireland, or Wales. The Romans brought with them their infrastructure, Latin, and Christianity during the nearly 400 years which they ruled over the Britons. But when the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome in 410, the Romans withdrew from England. The Roman Britons were left to defend themselves against the rest of the Celts, the Irish, Scottish, and Picts, who had not been conquered by Rome, and this was the beginning of the Dark Ages. The Britons attempted to recruit the Saxons from the mainland to defend them against their northern adversaries. But when the Germanic tribes saw the opportunity for easy settlement, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, coming from Germany and Denmark, invaded Britain. However, we know from the archaeological record that the Roman Britons managed to temporarily halt the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain and even cause them to retreat. And we have several references to a great leader who led this defense. The most concrete comes from the 6th century monk Gildas. On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, he writes, quote, "The poor remnants of our nation, being strengthened by God, took arms under the conduct of Ambrosius Aurelianus, a modest man, who, of all the Roman nation, was then alone in the confusion of this troubled period, by chance left alive. His parents, who for their merit were adorned with the purple, had been slain in these same broils, and now his progeny, in these our days, although shamefully degenerated from the worthiness of their ancestors, provoked to battle their cruel conquerors, and by the goodness of our Lord obtained the victory." End quote. So we have ample evidence for a figure who perhaps had partial Roman ancestry and led the Britons in defense against the Saxon invasion. This figure would later come to be named Arthur by medieval historians. a great king and military leader who was born in Tintagel and was buried nearby at Glastonbury. And it just so happens that, at the archaeological site of Tintagel, we have the ruins of a fortified British settlement from around the time when this Arthur would have lived. A settlement with a complex material culture, which appears to show that they were trading with the Mediterranean and even Constantinople by sea, which is extremely impressive given these circumstances, but also makes sense for a once Roman colony. And it was at this site that they found a partial inscription with the name Artogano. The evidence for Arthur's connection with this Roman Britain warlord is much more extensive, but in short, it seems likely that Arthur was a historical figure, and the story of this great leader, who for a time managed to halt the Saxons, would serve as the foundation of the Arthurian tradition, which was shared by the peoples of medieval Europe. The canon of Arthurian literature is vast, and the texts are written in Latin, Welsh, Old French, Middle English, Middle High German, and Old Norman. Arthurian literature is the culmination of all of these peoples and their pagan traditions syncretized with Roman Christianity. In this sense, they are truly medieval texts, as they represent the matrix of Northern European peoples and cultures out of which arose the medieval iteration of the heroic ideal. I would go so far as to say that Arthurian literature was, for medieval Europe, what the Iliad was for the Greeks. The key ideas of Arthurian literature are the knight, romance, and chivalry. Romance was originally a literary term, denoting that a text was written in a dialect, i.e. a Romance language, rather than Latin. It is Chrétien de Troyes' 5 chivalric romances, written in Old French, which serve as the foundation of all Arthurian literature which followed. It is through the Arthurian romances that romance came to mean what it does today, a heroic, chivalric view of love and passion, which I would argue was already present in the classical tradition, but which was certainly solidified in Arthurian literature. In Chrétien's romances, we also get the notion of chivalry, which comes from the French word chevalier, meaning knight, which in turn comes from the French cheval, meaning horse. Here, all the way in the Middle Ages, and I would argue even as late as the cowboys of the American frontier, we see echoes of the Indo-European horse warriors. The cheval was the medieval iteration of the classical hero, and in the notion of chivalry, we see a romantic vision of heroism, which makes use of what are, at least nominally, Christian values. Yet, as I said earlier, the essence of medieval chivalry is classical and pagan in nature. I will give an example. In Chrétien de Troyes' Knight of the Cart, an unknown knight arrives at Arthur's court during the Ascension Day feast, which celebrates Christ's ascension to heaven after he descended into hell and freed the souls imprisoned there. The mysterious knight announces that Guinevere has been taken to the land of Gore and is being held there. He says, quote, "I do not bring you news of them because I intend to return them to you. Rather, I want to inform you that you have neither wealth nor power enough to ensure their release, and you know well that you will die before you are able to come to their aid." End quote. As seen in this passage, the land of Gore is continually referred to using the language of death, and is clearly on one level the Celtic otherworld, with the mysterious knight being the king of the dead. Guinevere thus plays the role of Persephone here, to use the most commonly known version of this pagan motif. Lancelot sets out after Guinevere, thus taking on the role of both the classical hero and Christ in his descent into the other world. He soon encounters a dwarf in a cart who says that he can bring Lancelot to the land of Gore if he gets into the cart. Here we see the pagan ferryman motif. But out of shame, Lancelot hesitates 2 steps before getting into the dwarf's cart. Chrétien writes, quote, "He would regret this moment of hesitation, and be accursed and shamed for it. Reason, who does not follow love's command, told him to beware of getting in, and counseled him not to do anything by which he might incur disgrace or reproach, but love urged and commanded him to climb into the cart at once." End quote. As Lancelot enters into the kingdom of Gore, into the land of the dead, he also enters into a state of sin due to his hesitation. We are told explicitly that Lancelot's sin was showing cowardice by not giving himself fully to love, to passion, to daring, and by hesitating before entering the cart for fear of shame. This notion of sin is very different from the idea of sin in early and later Christianity. Lancelot's sin is cowardice. It is equivalent to if Achilles had hesitated before leaping into battle to avenge Patroclus. And the idea of love here is very different from other Christian notions of love. Love here is heroic passion. I could give countless other examples of how these texts, despite being within a Christian framework, are essentially pagan in their character, setting, and worldview. One example is the use of nature as a creator, synonymous with God. In Eric and Enid, Chrétien first describes Enid's beauty as follows, quote, "The maiden was charming, in sooth, for nature had used all her skill in forming her. Nature herself had marveled more than 500 times how, upon this one occasion, she had succeeded in creating such a perfect thing. Never again could she strive so successfully to reproduce her pattern. Nature bears witness, concerning her, that never was so fair a creature seen in all the world. The complexion of her forehead and face was clearer and more delicate than the lily, but with wondrous art her face with all its delicate pallor was suffused with a fresh crimson, which nature had bestowed upon her. Her eyes were so bright that they seemed like two stars. God never formed better nose, mouth, and eyes. What shall I say of her beauty?" End quote. Here, nature is repeatedly invoked as a creator and referred to as she, and it is only towards the end of the passage that God appears. I consider Chrétien to be the most essential author in the Arthurian tradition, the one who most vividly represents this heroic, Christian yet pagan worldview. But there are many other great works in this tradition. Yet, during the Grail cycle of Arthurian literature, you can notice a distinctive shift in the worldview. The emphasis of the stories shifts from heroic values to Christian ascetic morality, with particular emphasis on chastity. Whereas in the earlier texts, Lancelot was considered to be the best knight because of his beauty and skill in combat, his excellence in love and war. In the Grail cycle, Percival is put forward as the better knight because he, unlike Lancelot, is moral and chaste. He does not pursue glory or the hands of fair maidens. He pursues only Christ and the Grail. Lancelot, in all his classical perfection, is shamed for his affair with Guinevere. Though he is a warrior equal in skill and beauty to Achilles, he is ultimately a failure because he is not chaste, not moral. And it may come as no surprise that many of the tales in this cycle of Arthurian literature were written by monks, not bards and poets like Chrétien. And here we get to the heart of the issue and of my argument. It is the heroic ideal, not the priestly ideal, which defines the Western tradition. Whether one is devoted to Odin, Christ, or Jupiter, in the end it is ultimately secondary to something more essential, whether one has a heroic and natural worldview. It is, and always has been, heroic values which define the West, and everything which goes against those values, whether it be the priestly forms of Christianity or American leftist and conservative ideology, is hostile to the West and seeks ultimately to strangle it. But the Christianity of Arthurian romance, on the whole, is distinctly heroic. In the Parzival of Eschenbach, a German author, Parzival is raised in the woods by his mother. After the death of Parzival's father, a knight, she seeks to prevent Parzival from following in his father's footsteps. Parzival's mother conceals his true identity from him and tells him nothing of knighthood. Yet, as a young man, Parsifal encounters a knight while hunting in the woods, and when he sees the imposing figure atop his steed, clad in brilliant armor, Parsifal thinks that he sees an angel. And learning of knighthood, he departs at once from the woods and the safety of his mother's care to become a knight. Knighthood for Parsifal is something internal, something in his blood, not a moral imperative, but an inborn destiny which he cannot escape. As a child, I, like many of you, I'm sure, spent many hours pretending to be a knight, inspired by Disney movies and tales of the Knights of the Round Table, brandishing sticks or dollar store plastic swords, slaying dragons, and saving maidens. What inspires young men is not the morality of the knight, his commitment to virginity or charity. Young men feel in their blood that there is something divine, something superhuman in Lancelot and his deeds. The knight radiates beauty and power, a beauty and power which is expressed in his heroic feats. So I beseech you, my Christian brothers, do not be tricked into thinking that your religion must be an anti-pagan religion which scorns nature. Do not be tricked into thinking that Christ can be only a God of chastity, charity, and all of the other thin and prudish modern moral values. Do not shame your ancestors and their heroes for being immoral. Choose the Christ who loved Lancelot for his beauty and courage. Choose the Christ who animated the forests of medieval Europe and stirred the hearts of knights to bold and courageous action. The Christ who ignited in the hearts of fair ladies burning passion for their chivalrous lovers. Choose the Christ who is present in the springtime lilies, the flushed cheeks of the lover, and the blood of the slain. Choose the Christ of Europe.
Be honest. Are all of us riding to our deaths?
Yes, we are.
And since we're dying anyway, you're saying that it's better if we at least die fighting?
I am. Everything that you thought had meaning, every hope, dream, or moment of happiness, none of it matters as you lie bleeding out on the battlefield. We all die. But does that mean our lives are meaningless? Does that mean that there was no point in our being born? Would you say that of our slain comrades? What about their lives? Were they meaningless? They were not! Their memory serves as an example to us all! The courageous fallen, the anguished fallen. Their lives have meaning because we, the living, refuse to forget them! And as we ride to certain death, we trust our successors to do the same for us! Because my soldiers do not buckle or yield when faced with the cruelty of this world! My soldiers push forward! My soldiers scream out! My soldiers rage!
It gladdens me to know that Odin prepares for a feast. Soon I shall be drinking ale from curved horns. This hero that comes into Valhalla does not lament his death. The Aesir will welcome me. My death comes without apology. And I welcome the Valkyries to summon me home. I shall not enter Odin's hall with fear. There, I shall wait for my sons to join me. And when they do, I will bask in their tales of triumph.
You expected me a speech. I have only one to give, and it is the same one I'd give were we not standing on the brim of a battlefield. It is the same one I'd give were we to meet in the street by chance. I have only ever hoped for one thing: to see this kingdom united under this English crown. All men are born to die, we know it. We carry it with us always. If your day be today, so be it. Mine will be tomorrow. Or mine today and yours tomorrow, it matters not. What matters is that you know in your hearts that today you are that kingdom united. You are England. Each and every one of you. England is you. And it is the space between you. Fight not for yourselves. Fight for that space. Fill that space. Make it tissue. Make it mass. Make it impenetrable. Make it yours. Make it England. Make it England. Great men to it, captains, lords. Great men to it.